Good evening and welcome to the very first Royal College of Pathologists Book Club event. Today we will be chatting about the topical and very timely book, The Pandemic Century, A History of Global Contagion from Spanish Flu to COVID-19. My name is Kit Heath. I am a healthcare scientist in virology and immunology, so it's definitely really topical. And I currently work as Deputy Lead Healthcare Scientist at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. I also work for Health Education England as lead assessor for healthcare science apprenticeships at level 2 and 4. And outside of my work in the NHS, I'm a science communicator and stand-up comic. I've been involved with the Royal College outreach activities for a couple of years, stretching back to the Blood and Bugs project that they did at Highclere Castle back for the 2018 centenary for the end of World War I, which was really good fun. I'm delighted to introduce medical historian and author of The Pandemic Century, Dr. Mark Honigsbaum. Mark is a medical historian, senior lecturer in journalism at City University, and a regular contributor to the Observer and The Lancet. He also hosts the podcast series, Going Viral, the Mother of All Pandemics, and his TED Ed animation, How Pandemics Have Spread, has been viewed nearly 3 million times. Mark is the author of 5 books, and published his most recent book, The Pandemic Century, 100 Years of Panic, Hysteria and Hubris, in April 2019. It was selected as an editor's pick by the New York Times and also named as a Health Book of the Year by the Financial Times. In June 2020, a revised paperback edition, which is the one that we'll be reviewing today, was published with a new chapter on COVID-19. Mark and I are joined by 3 brilliant panelists. Firstly is Ange Ahuja, who is a contributing writer on science for the Financial Times and writes a regular opinion column for the paper, first writing about a mysterious pneumonia in Wuhan on the 8th of January 2020. The Pandemic Century was featured as one of her 2019 Financial Times Health Books of the Year. Ange also contributes to other media outlets, including The New Statesman, Prospect, and BBC Radio 4. She was educated at a comprehensive school in Essex and has a PhD in space physics. She is a trustee of Sense About Science and is also involved with Speakers for Schools, which gives state school students access to motivational speakers and work experience opportunities for free. Professor Will Irving has been professor and honorary consultant in virology at the University of Nottingham and Nottingham University Hospitals NHS Trust since 2002. He currently chairs the National Strategy Group for Viral Hepatitis and is a member of the Advisory Committee on the Safety of Blood, Tissues and Organs, which advises UK ministers and health departments on the most appropriate ways to ensure the safety of blood, cells, tissues, and organs for transfusion and transplantation. His research interest is a natural history of hepatitis C virus infection. Will recently chaired the Royal College's weekly COVID-19 webinar series. In his spare time, Will is a keen bridge player and, in his own words, has a ridiculous passion for the fortunes of Leeds United. Dr. Shoaib El Khalifa is a clinical immunology consultant currently working at Salford Royal NHS Foundation Trust and is also a lecturer at the University of Manchester. Shoaib is currently a trustee member of the UK Primary Immunodeficiency Network and editor at the Rheumatology Journal. He has published in the field of immunodeficiency, autoimmunity, drug allergy, and anaphylaxis. Shoaib has been involved in several RCPath events, including this year's online undergraduate and foundation Taster Day, where he highlighted how important immunology has been in the fight against COVID-19. When he's not working, Shoaib enjoys music, dancing, and meditation. And when we're not in a global pandemic, he also loves to travel. So tonight's event is part of the college's National Pathology Week and will include a reading by Mark, after which we will be chatting to the panelists to find out what they thought of the pandemic century and also exploring some of the key themes and ideas covered in the book. We'll then have some time for questions from the audience. So please submit your questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom, where our lovely team from the Royal College will be passing them through. And we will do our best to get through as many of them as we can. Just a little bit of housekeeping. This event is being recorded and it will be made available on the RCPath YouTube channel. And in the interest of social media, please do tweet about this event using hashtag RCPath Book Club and hashtag Pathology Week. The Twitter handle for the college is RCPath. So now I'm going to hand over to Mark. Mark, please could you tell us a little bit about the pandemic century and about the excerpt you'll be reading today?
It's hard to know where to begin, really. I suppose the best place to begin, really, is I've been thinking about this book, researching and thinking about the themes of it for over 15 years. I suppose it all goes back to the bird flu outbreaks of the early noughties, when I was still working as a journalist for the Observer. But long story short, that persuaded me to embark on a PhD at the Wellcome Center for the History of Medicine, the UCL, in 2007. My PhD was on influenza because I was interested in, why there was so much panic about bird flu in the early noughties and how had people responded back in 1918. But long story short, that led me to think about other epidemics and pandemics. And it hadn't escaped my attention that, bird flu was just the latest in a succession of epidemics that seemed to be increasing with frequency. After that, we had swine flu. And then in 2014, after I completed my PhD, there was the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, which I was lucky enough to be able to cover and do some research on. I think, Anjana, you were there too, so you've had that experience. But really, the book was written to try and answer a couple of questions. The main question, really, the best way I can set it up, it's really the epigraph from the book. I think it's found its way into the UK paperback edition. But it was an epigraph from Camus' The Plague, a very famous epigraph, where he says, "Everybody knows that pestilences have a way of recurring in the world. Yet somehow we find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. There have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet plagues and wars always take people by surprise." So the book is really an attempt to answer that question, but really from multiple perspectives. So I draw on the philosophy of scientific knowledge, but also studies in the history of science into laboratory technologies and tools. And I suppose that's where pathologists come in. I mean, when I was invited to do this talk, I don't think I quite appreciated how big a starring role pathologists have in the book. They crop up time and again, not always strictly in the guise of pathologists, but as microbiologists who have to draw on pathology techniques. So I suppose the first person who pops up is in 1918 when William Welch, who was then the most famous pathologist in the United States, trained in German laboratory methods. There was the outbreak of Spanish influenza at US Army camps in Boston. And he was one of the first people to pathologize a lung from someone with one of these severe pneumonias and realized that he'd never seen this sort of pathology before. So that kind of sets up, I suppose, the themes. But as you go through the book, you'll see that we're only as good at identifying diseases as we have tools that enable us to do that. And those tools frequently comprise laboratory media. And of course, the reason we know that a particular laboratory technique works is because we've discovered it before in relation to a previous disease. But what about a disease that we've never encountered before and we don't know about? So here we are in the territory of, Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns, or even, as I like to think of it, and I think a lot of the epidemics illustrate this, it's kind of a fourth category of knowledge called the unknown known. So a good example of that is Zika. We'd known about Zika since 1947, but nobody had really realized that Zika could be associated with these congenital deformities, microcephaly, until it erupted in Brazil in 2015. Anyway, so those are some of the themes of the book. Also a lot of it's really in the subtitle. 100 years in the original hardback edition, it was called 100 Years of Panic, Hysteria and Hubris. And I think the whole world has had a lesson in hubris in relation to COVID-19. I don't think we've ever been at a moment that's been so humbling for science, and where so many governments and politicians have got it wrong, and indeed are still getting it wrong. No names mentioned there. Okay, so I'm just going to read a short extract from a chapter on Legionnaires Disease. This was actually one of the most complex chapters to write, because there was an awful lot to explain, both about the original epidemiological investigation, which actually ended inconclusively after 6 months. And one of the characters who featured in the first part of that chapter was a public health microbiologist called Joe McDade. He had recently joined the CDC shortly before the Legionnaires outbreak. Just to recall, this was an outbreak at a hotel in Philadelphia that coincided with a convention of American Legionnaires, an elderly population. And they were all, spent 5 days in a hotel, drinking, smoking. People smoked a lot back then. One of the anecdotes I like as well, researching this book, I was lucky enough to go to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., where they had a massive collection of archival material, including the original gift packs that the Legionnaires were given when they arrived at the Belvedere Hotel. And in this gift pack was a packet of Merit cigarettes, right? They used to hand out Merit cigarettes to conventionaires in those days. This was an extremely bad idea, especially for an elderly demographic who are prone to asthma and other diseases. And it caused lots of confusion, because when the outbreak occurred and people developed these atypical pneumonias, they basically suspected a whole series of diseases, beginning with influenza, swine flu, and including things like chlamydia, psittacosis, which is spread by parrots, another of the chapters in my book's about that. And they basically, the microbiologists had to try and exclude a series of pathogens. And at one point it fell to Joe McDade, who actually was trained as a rickettsia specialist. So rickettsia are diseases typically spread by arthropods like lice and fleas, or ticks, really. So he was designated to investigate whether Legionnaires could have been caused by Q fever. So long story short, his method was to inoculate the infectious material into guinea pigs. He would then wait several days to allow them to develop disease. He would then euthanize them, extract their spleens, and then take a section and make a smear on a laboratory medium, and see if he could see any bacteria, through the lens of his optical microscope. The problem is that Legionella are very hard to stain. They don't take the typical stains that were then used in public health research. Nevertheless, using conventional stains, McDade in August of 1976 succeeded in spotting here and there some unusual bacteria through the lens of his microscope. But he couldn't see anything definite, and he was eventually told that there were probably contaminants, because guinea pigs were notoriously dirty creatures. This is what he was told by his colleagues. So he basically eventually gave up. And 6 months go by, and we're now in December of 1976, coming into the new year. And this is when Joe McDade returned to his researchers, because he's the sort of guy that just can't let anything go. I don't know if that chimes with anyone online, but he liked to sort of, things festered in his mind. So I'll just read the extract. There is an old saying in medical research: fortune favors the prepared mind. The saying is usually attributed to Louis Pasteur, who famously stumbled on a vaccine against chicken cholera in 1880, when a colleague inoculated some chickens with an old culture of chicken cholera germs. In McDade's case, however, it was because he was a novice to public health microbiology, and therefore not schooled in the same thought processes as his colleagues, that a chance observation led him to the answer that had eluded them for 6 months. It also helped that McDade was a worrier and a perfectionist. To his way of thinking, the peculiar rod-shaped bacteria he had weakly glimpsed through his microscope in August represented a loose end, and he didn't like it. However, it was not until late December that he thought to return to the problem. The impetus was a conversation with a man who had cornered him at a party shortly before Christmas. I don't know how he knew I was CDC, but he did, recalled McDade. He said, "We know you scientists are a little weird, but we count on you. and we're very disappointed. I stuttered because I didn't know what to say, but it bothered me and it stuck in my mind. It had always been McDade's habit to use the week before Christmas and New Year to resolve any outstanding paperwork in preparation for the new working year. While tidying his office, he spotted the glass sides with the smears he had taken from the guinea pigs in a box on the shelf and decided to have another look. The exercise he recalled was like, and I'm quoting, searching for a missing contact lens on a basketball court with your eyes 4 inches away from the floor. Eventually, however, McDade spotted a cluster of organisms in the corner of one of the microscopic fields. To McDade's way of thinking, that the fact that the organisms were clustered together suggested that it wasn't just organisms that happened to be there, but were actually growing there inside the guinea pig. It was at this point that McDade decided to have another go at culturing the organism. His thinking was, and I'm quoting, if I can rule out that it has nothing to do with the disease, my conscience will be salved and I can go about my business, close quote. It was at this point that McDade's expertise as a rickettsial specialist and his willingness to depart from conventional patterns of thought came into play. Going to the freezer drawers containing spleen tissue from suspect guinea pigs that had been put on ice in August, McDade thawed the samples and inoculated some of the tissue into embryonated chicken eggs. However, this time, he withheld antibiotics in order to allow whatever organisms were present in the guinea pigs tissue to grow freely. 5 to 7 days later, the eggs died, and McDade took new smears. As before, he applied a Legionnaires strain, a technique which had been developed specifically for a rickettsial organism, and once again spotted the same rod-shaped bacteria growing in clusters. Could these bacteria be responsible for the guinea pig's deaths? And could the same bacteria be responsible for the Legionnaires disease outbreak? To answer the question, McDade retrieved some preserved serum from the Legionnaires cases and mixed it with the organism he had found in the eggs. If a patient's serum contained antibodies specific to the organism, an observable reaction would take place. It did. I'm quoting, "They just lit up dramatically," he said. "My neck hair bristled. I wasn't sure what I got there, but I knew it was something." So I could go on, but I think that that's enough, and it gives you a flavor of, the excitement of, laboratory discovery. When you're all there sort of trying to think outside the box and try techniques that nobody else has tried, and you're a little bit out on the limb, but eventually it works. There are plenty of other examples, of course, particularly from the SARS outbreak in 2003, but I think I'll leave it there because I'm sure there are quite a few questions you might have about other themes of the book.
Thanks, Mark. That was really interesting. And I completely agree. Scientists are just a little bit weird, but I'm all right with it. So for everyone watching, if you've got any questions about the section that Mark has just read, please do let us know in the Q&A section. And so I thought we get straight on the discussion. And I know that Will has a burning question about the content of the book. So I'm going to start with Will.
Hi there, Mark. Fantastic book. Really enjoyed reading it, especially the later chapters, which were mostly viruses and through which I've lived through in my professional career. You would clearly have no shortage of epidemics or pandemics to choose from. And I wondered, what criteria did you use to select the particular pandemics, the particular organisms that have made it into the book? And I should say, you've missed out my favorite virus, which is hepatitis C. So how did you choose?
Well, thank you very much, Will. Yeah, I've had a few brushes with hepatitis, not C, other ones, on my travels. Well, I mean, the short answer is that the epidemics were selected because I wanted to choose epidemics where scientists had really been floundering in the dark, or rather laboring under a misapprehension about the causal pathogen. usually because of overconfidence or like thinking, oh, we've seen this before, this is what it is. The other thing that was important was, and perhaps I could have made this clearer in the book, is that there's something different or special about the last 100 years of epidemic outbreaks. And that's because they coincide with the modern period. What I mean by that is that it's kind of obvious that as the course of the 20th century now into the 21st century has progressed, these epidemics and pandemics are becoming more frequent than they were in the past. And that's got to do with all sorts of reasons, but essentially it's because of global communications and the way that we are putting pressure on animal ecologies, but also the way that medical science is continually creating new disease risks. And that's brought up very strongly by the chapter on Legionnaires disease. So if we didn't build hotels and convention centers with cooling towers where Legionnaires could breed, it wouldn't be a problem, essentially. And modern food production processes create the same risk around bird and swine flus and now coronavirus. But I also wanted to choose some unusual epidemics and outbreaks because a lot of these diseases are familiar about and been written many times before. So I wanted to draw people's attention to lesser known or perhaps forgotten ones. So the parrot fever outbreak in 1930 is an example of that. But the other chapter that I enjoyed very much writing was the one about the plague outbreak in Los Angeles. Everyone knows about bubonic plague in San Francisco, but nobody seems to know that there was an even worse outbreak, pneumonic plague, something you're not supposed to see outside of a cold, humid climate, such as you get in Manchuria, in, sunny Southern California. And that really brought into play a lot of the themes that I'm interested in exploring alongside the science, which is really about how the media amplifies scientific messages around risk and also uncertainty about the causation of epidemics. So I'm sorry I didn't get to hepatitis, but I wanted to, choose big ones.
That's for your next book. Yeah.
For me, my favorite virus is the Ebola virus because I was actually based in Sierra Leone in an Ebola treatment center in 2015. So you hit my favorite if you didn't manage everybody's. So I got a couple of questions as well for the other panelists. So particularly for Will and Shuaib, but obviously everybody feel free to jump in. How has the latest pandemic, COVID-19, impacted on your work?
Well, first of all, I'm sure this is true for Anjana as well, but I've never been busier. I mean, people are very interested in epidemics and pandemics. So it's strange because I have mixed emotions about it. On the one hand, I'm hating the fact that we're going into second lockdown and it's caused so much misery. But it's also been a tremendous opportunity for, the whole world. The publics are getting an education in public health and public health epidemiology, and they're interested in the questions that animated the book in a way that I don't think they would have been were it not for COVID-19. And I think that's a good thing because if you talk to any scientists, to veterinary ecologists and people who live and breathe disease ecology, they will all tell you that this is not the last epidemic or pandemic new pathogen that's going to emerge from most likely an animal reservoir. So we are going to be faced with these risks increasingly. We have to learn how to deal with them and prepare for them and anticipate them better than we did COVID-19.
I think as I've been a science journalist for probably 25 years now, and I first covered a disease outbreak. It was the H5N1 in the one you were talking about, the early noughties, in Vietnam. And the thing is when you cover outbreaks like that, or Ebola, or Zika, or even SARS, they're so remote. If you live in Europe, and if you live on an island here, these things happen they might as well be on different planets. I mean, you write about them from quite a detached. I write about it because they're interesting. I write for a global newspaper, so it's always interesting to write about these big outbreaks. But you know, I like Mark, I have had the busiest year of my life. I mean, every time you write about these epidemics, where, you know, even though they are distant, you're always somewhere in your piece you're going to say people predict the next one is going to be, you know, like the Spanish flu, it could go worldwide, we're keeping tabs on it, and then of course it happens. I mean, I would never have guessed that back in January, in that first week of January, writing about the mysterious Wuhan pneumonia, that I was going to be writing about it for the rest of the year. That's something I didn't expect, but it really brings it home when you're living and breathing it.
And Will?
Hi, can I ask Mark, in the context of what we're going through now, having studied all these other pandemics, do you think we should have been better prepared? Were there lessons, are there generic lessons that we could have learned from studying flu in 1918 and Legionella and HIV? I mean, they're very different organisms. They're spread by different routes. They have different consequences to the infected patient. But just at an organizational level, either at how WHO responds on a global level, or how governments respond in a country level, or how physicians and pathologists on the ground, who are the people who deal with these emerging infections, should we have learnt lessons that meant we could have done better with COVID-19?
Yes, is the short answer. I mean, the lessons have been clear for some time. So I divide them into two sorts. There are the ecological lessons. So there are all sorts of insights. I mean, beginning of the 1930s, the heyday of bacteriology, there were always bacteriologists who actually combined pathology and field epidemiology, who realized that there were certain environmental and ecological conditions that contributed or made it more likely that pathogens that normally reside in animal populations would be able to make the transfer to human populations. And, you know, these processes have been exacerbated by a combination of factors. I won't list them all. I'm sure they're familiar to a lot of your membership. But the other factors are really social. Okay, so we know that there are all sorts of social behaviors that make it more likely that when an epidemic disease emerges into a population, it will spread more widely. So Ebola is a good example of that. Typically, Ebola emerges in remote forested regions, but it's only when people descend on a clinic or hospital that the infection gets amplified in that medical setting. And usually it's because the hospital isn't very well equipped. You know, they don't have proper disinfectant or even running water. They're reusing syringes. And, you know, of course, there are these long-standing theories that HIV/AIDS may have been amplified in the same way once it, navigated that genetic bottleneck from monkeys to humans. But I think the big lessons are that there were plenty of people warning about this, including the WHO. I think the WHO was rightly criticized at the time of Ebola for being kind of complacent, that because all the previous 12 large Ebola outbreaks have been in Central Africa and in remote forested regions. Nobody really took seriously that the outbreak in Guinea Forestier at the end of 2014 could be Ebola. And even when they realized it was Ebola, very few people thought that it could actually, set up a chain of infections and reach a big urban area. So that was a big mistake. And then Zika brought home, other sort of blind spots in our knowledge. And as a result of that, as you know, in 2017, they came up with a new category called Disease X, which they put on the International Health Regulation thing called an R&D blueprint. But basically, that was there to say there could be some pathogen that we don't know about yet. And we have to prepare for that too. what that meant in terms of science was one needed to invest in research into kind of neglected diseases, and there was a long list, of which coronaviruses like MERS or SARS were actually on that list, so that we could, you know, be in a position to rapidly develop therapeutics and vaccines if and when, you know, the unexpected or the unlikely happened. So I think that's one lesson, but I think the bigger lessons are really political. And I think we've seen that on these expert committees that advise politicians, there's a really kind of imbalance. We have a lot of virologists and epidemiologists and disease modelers, but we don't have enough frontline public health people. So we could talk about this endlessly, but I'm continually struck by the way in which in West Africa during the Ebola epidemic, but even in Africa now, governments there have done a much better job generally of contact tracing and getting on top of the infection chains than we have. And I think that's really because if you put public health experts, give them the lead and put them in the driving seat, they will apply tried and tested public health lessons to drive down those infections. And I think that's been the single biggest failure, and the reason we're about to go into a second lockdown here.
And Shoaib, you had a question?
Thank you. Mark, I've enjoyed the book so much. It's very interesting and exciting. And I think the details you've come and you've presented in the book was just unbelievable, especially from the immunologist's point of view. I found some sections took my attention really well, and actually I couldn't stop reading. Like when I start a chapter, I have to finish that chapter. So it was very interesting.
You're my ideal reader.
But actually, it just got me really excited, especially when you talk about the immunology. And I think one of the most impressive, I think, commentative mentions in the book was what about the holistic approach for these diseases. And I think sometimes as doctors, we miss that. We concentrate so much on the actual cause of the disease, as a microbes, for example, viral, bacterial, but then we forget the holistic picture. And that was very obvious with COVID-19. I mean, the virus itself, majority of patients will be asymptomatic, but what we faced is the whole associated cytokine storms and a lot of other immune complications related to that. And I think in few other diseases you see that, and a lot of damage sometimes happen not because of the virus or the bacteria, because of the immune activation. And you've written this really beautifully in your book. And I think I would definitely, for my trainee and student, I would actually ask them to read certain sections in this book, and especially the HIV section when you're going through the technology and the CD4 and the specific types of the lymphocyte and their involvement. I think that was very interesting.
That was, yeah, actually, I'm glad you reminded me of the HIV/AIDS chapter. That was undoubtedly the most difficult and complicated chapter to write. But I think it's important because, as you'll gather, that's actually the exception to the rule or the theme that links the other epidemics, because actually HIV/AIDS emerged at the only time in history where scientists would have been equipped to identify a hitherto unknown retrovirus. So I found that really interesting. Yeah, it gave me another insight into the history of science. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right about immunology. It's fundamental. And I think this applies to, when I'm talking to friends or family or people who ask me random questions, which is always like, when is it going to end? There's really going to be another lockdown. I keep on coming back. I just don't think people really understand immunology. And, I kind of, I think when Clinton was running against Bush, whenever it was, his slogan was, "It's the economy, stupid." And I don't mean to say people are stupid, but it's immunology stupid. Nobody anywhere in the world had any acquired immunity to the coronavirus. Perhaps there was some background genetic immunity or humoral immunity, and that makes it different from influenza, as you know, because even when a new pandemic flu virus emerges, it always shares quite a few proteins in common with the previous virus. And therefore there is this cross protection. And, you know, when they model the spread of influenza virus, there's usually when 30% of the population has been infected and recovered, that's when the R drops. And, you know, but I don't think we can't count on that with coronavirus. We just don't know if that's the case.
Absolutely. I think that's 100%. And I think the main lesson here, how we can learn not to interfere with the ecological system and how we can be friendly with that, because you can see it's all about a spillover from already, you know, organisms living in the forest or living somewhere there, but then because of our intervention and with the whatever technology we've been using, then we made a lot of problems out of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, of course, we don't know precisely how the coronavirus emerged or where. I mean, all we know is that it's very, very, well, 96% similar to a bat virus that was identified in a cave in southern Yunnan, I believe, in 2013. I think that's right. But you know, people like Peter Daszak, the Eco Health Alliance, who has traveled extensively in these regions, says that these spillover events are occurring all the time. You know, whenever a farmer goes into a bat cave to collect guano to fertilize his fields, or a tourist enters the same cave with a guide and, you know, gets bat feces on them, there's a potential risk. Thankfully, though, what's hard is for a new pathogen that emerges to actually set up a chain of infections. And that's the missing bit of the puzzle, I think. We don't know how or where that occurred. But I was struck by, I discovered that, I think in 2017, the Chinese built a high-speed rail link from Wuhan to Kunming. So all it would really have taken was for some farmer or someone incubating the virus to get on that train to introduce it to Wuhan. You know, the rest is history. Yeah.
Can I ask, and I would urge people out there to get the book. It is a brilliant read, brilliantly researched, beautifully written. And even though I consider myself fairly well read when it comes to diseases and pandemics and epidemics and so on, I never knew about the parrot fever, and I loved that chapter just because, you know, so people weren't dropping dead like flies, they were dropping dead like parrots. But I wanted to ask you, Mark, about something that I found very engaging in your book, which was the framing of pathologist as hero. And so do you think that it is fairer to say that it is an individual, you know, the insights that we get into the causes of disease rely heavily on individual insight, brilliance, instinct, or do you think that pathology is really about, it's a team sport?
I mean, that's a very good question. So I'll answer this way. I'm not actually quite sure of the answer, but what struck me, I mean, part of what I wanted to do with this book is show how, you know, if you go back to the beginnings of bacteriology and germ theory, it was possible for a single scientist to encompass several disciplines. So I suppose one of the heroes of my book is Carl Friedrich Meyer, who was a brilliant Swiss pathologist, but he was also a brilliant laboratory technician, and he combined that with, you know, field epidemiology and being able to make links and deductions in the field that would sort of lead him to sort of investigate a particular idea and, you know, pursue that in the laboratory. Today, of course, it's a little bit more complicated, but it was interesting to me when you dug down into each of these outbreaks, and I think SARS is a classic example of that, it really did take, you know, as kind of a small team, in this case, a team at Hong Kong University, to, you know, just sort of try new things. You know, they went through all the sort of typical ways of culturing pathogens, and then they said, let's try something different. But you know, I mean, and now this is in the era where you have all sorts of ways of, you know, splicing bits of genetic code, you know, using sort of PCR and these sort of techniques. But they still had to be quite innovative. I was struck by how every time it took some sort of, you know, brainwave, really, sort of some sort of thinking outside the box, and the really the willingness to try something different that isn't in the textbook. I think that's really the thing. And that makes sense, of course, because when you're dealing with an unknown pathogen, you have to sort of think outside the box, because it's highly unlikely that, you know, the techniques you used before are going to enable you to sort of solve the mystery. But I do think there is, I mean, increasingly there is, you know, we've seen that teamwork, I think, this time. So, you know, with SARS-1 in 2002, you know, the Chinese didn't share information. They didn't publish the genome. They didn't know what, you know, what they were dealing with, and their instinct was to cover it up. But of course, this time round, you know, by mid-December, Chinese scientists have published, you know, the whole genetic sequence online, and immediately scientists were able to look at it and start, you know, studying the coronavirus. So I think that's a big change, yeah.
It's interesting that you chose McDade as well, because I mean, he was very interesting because it wasn't quite his area.
No.
And this idea that he was the kind of person who didn't like loose ends
Yeah.
made me laugh, actually, because, you know, you need people, you need those warriors, and you need the you know, the really dogged people that crack on. And again, with SARS, you were mentioning, I can't remember, because I don't have a microbiology background, sorry, but I do remember there was a very memorable paragraph where you talk about somebody trying things on 38-39 slides.
Yes, that's what, yeah.
And I was just thinking, you know, I'm definitely not the kind of person that would get to even the 20th slide on that. But, you know, you really do need to be a particular kind of person. But it's a lovely book.
Yes, you need obsessives.
So, Mark's touched on it a little bit, but what do the panel as a whole think that we could learn about the importance of effective public engagement from a book like this, and from the fact that to a certain extent there's been the same mistake over and over again throughout history?
May I start? I think one of the lessons you can see throughout the pandemics is a communication between politics to general public, between scientists to politics and public, and where you get the right information. I think the misinformation you can see obvious, and how, I mean, when I was reading the AIDS section, HIV and AIDS, and all of a sudden everyone having a face mask and gloves and all that, and the whole panic about that. And I think that was just a reflection of the lack of communication. I think communication was really an important part of it.
It's also lack of knowledge, isn't it? I mean, in the early stages of any disease, you're going to get panic. You know, especially when people start talking about the plague, and so on. Because if you look, I mean, I can just about remember, not quite. I mean, I was very, very young then, but the emergence of HIV. I mean, the terror in the gay community at that time. And even you sort of growing up, it's really only in the past kind of, you know, not few years, but it took a long time for it to go from being something that killed you to something that you could live with. And as far as communication is concerned, it's really interesting, because I think when and this is something else that comes across in the book really well, I think, because you talk about the headlines at the time, and of course I see it from both sides, because I'm writing about COVID and other diseases, but I'm also really interested in what makes effective health messaging, and they are slightly different. And I think that's one thing that I really wish could be better. Is it kind of giving people really clear, consistent, usable messages that articulates what the purpose of of any personal action will be, what the end game is, which is something that we don't really know at the larger scale, but we something that we're not very sure about. So we're kind of all stumbling around in the dark with our face, space, hands message and so on. But also that does reflect, I guess, the fact that a lot of the science that we're using now to, the non-pharmaceutical interventions like masking, distancing and so on, some of the evidence for that is not very clear. It's quite ambiguous or is very old. And that does surprise me because, for example, I've been writing for months about aerosol transmission. And I don't know about you, Mark, but I just wish that somebody could just set up these experiments where they actually aerosolized the virus and actually measured how much transmission there is. I mean, how have you noticed the evolution of messaging through the pandemics that you've chosen?
Through the pandemics that I've chosen. Well, when you say that, I think back immediately to 1918, where there was very little public health messaging. But the messaging, such as there was quite similar. I mean, it was, people wore masks in some cities, but there was also this fascinating debate about whether it was better to open a window if someone had flu or close it. So there were some doctors who were advocates of open air therapy, but others who said no, because, the influenza germ could enter through the window. That was actually the sort of, the idea behind this famous children's rhyme at the time, which was, I had a little bird, its name was Enza. I opened the window and in flew Enza. Some things don't ever really change with respiratory pathogens. So, I think part of the problem with COVID or the coronavirus is that it's not like plague or cholera or yellow fever or HIV/AIDS, where the pathognomic signs are written on the body. And, when you see someone, you can't mistake someone who has yellow fever because they get violently ill. And, likewise with cholera, you flee from someone in the throes of cholera. It's a foul and kind of repulsive kind of disease. And I think part of the challenge with COVID-19, but also it applies to influenza, is that, it doesn't have a very high mortality rate, but because of the sheer numbers of people who will be infected asymptomatically, the actual numbers as a proportion, the numbers will end up being very large numerically. But people just don't connect with that. I think this is where we are now. There are lots of people who said to me, well, I know that, there's circulating and I can see the numbers are going up, but I don't actually personally know that many people who, have been severely ill or have died. And I think that's the thing that public health messaging has to kind of get better at, kind of explaining the numbers. But it's difficult because there are constant disputes about the numbers, aren't there? And which numbers are accurate. And you get MPs, much to my frustration, who trot out these comparisons with the 1957 and 68 flus, but conflate, excess deaths from those things with like actual measurable deaths now. And I can say you're not comparing like with like. We're already way beyond that. We're only in the second wave, So it's quite frustrating, I think.
I guess also the messaging, it's difficult to encourage people to take action against something they can't see. Yeah. And so, for example, our second lockdown is a little bit of an example of that, isn't it? Because we're trying to get ahead of something that we can't see. We can't see the overwhelmed hospitals yet, or so exactly. on. And I just wonder if that is also the case for pandemic planning, because I know it's hard to plan anyway, but is it the case that unless something is on your doorstep, it's kind of like a war, it's confronting you, it's right in your face, that there's something about the human psyche that doesn't really kind of acknowledge it or
well, again I find myself returning to Camus, who compares plagues with wars and say that you know, a million unseen dead is just a kind of mist in the imagination. We you know, we're far more likely to respond when we actually know or have seen someone die personally than we are when it's just a statistic. I think that is the problem. It's down to the human imagination. And this also goes to where we've failed. I mean, you know, we need to get better at imagining pandemics. You know, I think another thing that was missing from SAGE was actually historians who could say, well, you know, thinking in 100-year blocks, there have been quite a few pandemics, so we should wake up. This could be one of them.
I think I also found it was sort of interesting to look at how public perceptions change. So in, I think it's the SARS chapter, Mark, you explain what an R value is. And I imagine that the difference in the percentage of the population who knew what an R value was when the book was published and the percentage of people who know now is probably quite statistically significant, having done absolutely no research in the area whatsoever.
Well, no, I think that's right. I think, you know, the public have had a tremendous education in public health and in, you know, and in epidemiology in particular. And I think that's interesting. But, you know, at the same time, there are still people who simply do not believe that coronavirus is real. So, and I think this is another great lesson, you know, science is always provisional, right? Even when we're pretty certain of something, you know, our theories or knowledge can always change or be adjusted. But also, there's always, when people are sort of engaging with science, it's very hard for them to put aside their ideological prejudices or convictions. And we're seeing that right now. It's really not about the science anymore. It's about, you know, what people value in society. Do they value, you know, liberty and their freedom to continue economic activity? Or do they think life and the preservation of life is the most fundamental thing that makes us a civilized society? And where you fall on that line is increasingly divided on political lines.
I think it's made it a very hard one for people to live through, because we're all living it, aren't we? You know, I've got my daughter's started university, having a freshers week unlike any other. I have another child at school, husband at home. And actually, I've always worked from home, you know, for a long time. So suddenly my domain has been invaded. But it's really interesting because I suppose the first thing to say is there's no easy answers. I mean, we really are having to sort of think on our feet and build the boat, as people say, while you're sailing. But it's going to the heart of really big questions about how we run our society, isn't it? And who we value, what premium we put on growing old, on children.
Exactly. So, I mean, unfortunately, I don't think medical history provides much a guide, because we really are in an unprecedented situation. So if you go back to 1918, you could have actually lived through that whole period and not realized there was a flu pandemic going on. Because first of all, you know, there was a world war and people they were all focused on, you know, that war had been going on for a long time. But more importantly, there wasn't a centralized, you know, Ministry of Health coordinating the response across the UK. In certain cities, such as Manchester, where they had progressive, far-sighted medical officers of health, there was more active public health messaging about the risks, but that wasn't true across the UK. And when you add on the fact that newspapers kind of downplayed the disease, except for the most fatal weeks, actually around now, October, November 1918, when you couldn't avoid reading the names of the dead from influenza pneumonia in the columns of the Times. You really didn't have all this risk messaging and this sort of fear. People, you know, went about, the war took priority. And of course, afterwards, people, I mean, I've been asked by a lot of journalists, so, we're seeing, because we're living through a period that is so turbulent and that is having these profound social and economic impacts, everyone assumes that must have been true at earlier points in history. But it really wasn't true in 1918. After the pandemic was over, there was a brief dip in, economic output, but very rapidly the economy returned to its pre-war steady state. I don't think that's going to be true today, precisely because, the world is so globally connected. And we have these long interconnected supply chains.
Okay, so I think we've got time for one final quick fire question. So I'm going to ask everyone to give their main takeaway from the pandemic century. So I will start. For me, I think in some ways the really interesting point was the last chapter, and Mark talks a lot about his experience during COVID, and there's a lot of facts and figures and just comparing the numbers. So there's a point where it says that the US was estimated to would have between 100,000 and 240,000 deaths. Well, I think they're on about 220,000 deaths, and they're still gaining nearly 100,000 cases a day. And it was an interesting sort of flashback of how it's only been 6 months, but in some ways it feels a lot longer. And I will move on to Ange.
Well, I found something in all of the chapters. The one I agree with you, Kip. The numbers are astonishing, and I'll tell you what though, that last chapter, this idea of what we need to do and how we need to prepare ourselves, it really doesn't differ from something that most public health people would say. And so the message has been remarkably consistent, probably since before this millennium, that things need to change, and we need to be more prepared, and we need to I wonder actually, and this is a question, I don't know if I might be a bit late for questions now, but in some ways I feel like this current pandemic is the dress rehearsal for the big one, because I don't think this is the big one in a way, because it's something that's taken a while for me to come to, partly because I felt like I spent the early part of the year grieving for the life that I thought we might lose, and now actually I'm in some senses I'm over it, because I kind of went through the grieving process early. But now I think I'm beginning to think about the good side, which is that we have those vaccines. The vaccine effort has been tremendous. I mean, something that I would never have thought, that you could identify a virus in January, and by the end of the year then possibly have 3 or 4 candidate vaccines ready to give to people. So I would like to ask that question just quickly to Mark. Has this been a good dress rehearsal in a way, given that it's been a relatively mild virus for the majority of the population?
Well, that is a good question. I must say, I certainly, I guess, yeah, I mean, we could have something much worse. It's theoretically possible and maybe even likely at some point. Yeah, I think certainly, we are going to be better prepared, because for a start, we know that it's possible for populations in democratic polities to actually persuade them to do things like quarantines and social distance on this scale. And certainly, if you'd asked me back in January when, we saw the Chinese quarantine Wuhan and then other cities, my initial reaction was, oh, that's impossible here. I kind of envisaged, roadblocks on the M25. I didn't think it would actually happen by, consensually, by people agreeing to modify their behavior. So I think that's a positive thing, that we can do it, we can pull together. But the worry, of course, is, will we? Because there's fatigue is set in now with a vengeance. And, I think that would be the most difficult challenge of all, actually, to persuade people to go through it again. And after COVID, to say, actually, you need to be more worried this time. I think that might be a hard message to sell.
Okay, and then so Will, what were your big takeaways from the pandemic century?
Before I get to that, in response to Angie's question, the really big hit is going to have three factors going for it. One is a virus, is an organism that is spread by the respiratory route, because one thing we all have to do is breathe. We can cook food, we can sterilize things, we can avoid sex, but we have to breathe. So it'll be a respiratory pathogen. The second thing is that it will have a high mortality rate. And so if Ebola, which has a 90% mortality, becomes transmissible by the airborne route, it won't, but then you've got a big, huge mortality. And the third critical feature is that the virus is excreted before the patient becomes symptomatic. So we've had two out of the three. SARS-1 was much more pathogenic, but it wasn't transmissible until the patients became ill. So we had a lucky escape there. Ebola is hugely virulent, but it's not transmitted by the respiratory route. So if you have the big whammy of all three, then you could wipe out large percentage of the population, I would agree. But to get back to the question, what message have I taken away from the book? I think it's a realization of how fragile human health is. You know, and it's a truism to say that as human beings, we feel we rule the earth, but actually we're a very insignificant part of it. And each of these pandemics has arisen through different routes, often ecological, changes in human behavior, changes in human movement, any one of which could trigger a completely new infection with an unknown agent. And it's just very, very fragile. And I remember when I started training in infection, in an era where there was an arrogant belief that we were just about to see the end of infectious disease. And looking back on that, I can't believe how we were taken in and what lessons we've learned, that is actually so far from the truth.
Fantastic. And Shoaib?
Well, there's a lot of lessons we can learn from this book. And I think, I think one of the main lessons for me is, first of all, pathologists always at the heart of healthcare, at the heart of all the pandemics. And pathologists, what are the people who usually diagnose these diseases at the end of the day? For me, McDade was the person to go for. McDade has just given me that kind of unlimited energy and tying all these loose ends, even between Christmas and New Year. I mean, that's just never happened to many people. I spend that time doing parties and preparing for whatever for the New Year. So that's I think what the message for the audience, I would say as well. You know, if you really want to kind of get into healthcare and do really a big thing in healthcare, think about pathology and think about how McDade have solved a problem that's been a mystery for almost more than 6 months. And I can go on for a long time, but I know the time is over for me. Thanks.
And just before we move on to questions from the audience, Mark, what take-homes do you have from the book that you wrote?
Oh, God. That's a difficult one. I mean, it's difficult to answer that question because I kind of lived or breathed it. But I suppose the main thing is that, like Anjana, I never really thought that we would see, you know, a big pandemic that disrupted the world in this way, even though I knew it was theoretically possible, because there'd been so many kind of false alarms or close shaves. And it's a difficult, when you study these things or you work in public health, you know, you're always treading this thin line between, you know, trying to alert people or being labeled an alarmist. And it's very, very difficult. And I think we do have to have some sympathy for the scientists who were advising the government back in January or February. But, you know, really for me, living through the pandemic has made me re-engage with a lot of my primary historical sources. And it's kind of given me new insights into how people experience say, the influenza pandemic in 1918. So one of the big take-homes for me, not from the book, but from COVID-19, is the way that pandemics and epidemics, even when they're universal pathogens, which respiratory pathogens surely are, they don't fall equally on all sections of society. So we've seen how people whose occupations or living conditions put them at much greater risk of getting this infection and dying. And that is true of a lot of past pandemics, although those features have often been overlooked. So, I mean, certainly, if you look at the historiography of the 1918 pandemic, flu was seen as this universal democratic killer that affected rich and poor, high and low equally. But now a lot of scientists and demographers are going back and saying, well, actually, this is not true. Let's dig more deeply into these numbers. And I think that is, that's something that's actually missing from the book, and that if I were rewriting it, I'd pay more attention to.
Brilliant. Okay, so we're going to move on to questions from the audience, and we do have a couple. So we'll start with a question from Shelley Hurd. What more does the panel think we should or could be doing at this point? For example, should university students really be going back to campuses for face-to-face teaching at this point? Anyone want to jump in?
Well, I mean, maybe someone who's an expert on transmission, but my understanding is that while primary school children below the age of, I think, 9, there's not much evidence that they are getting sick or spreading the disease. That's not true of the older age groups, and certainly university age, young adults are very, they're spreading it a lot, and they're very infectious. I speak as someone who's doing face-to-face teaching at the moment. I have mixed feelings about it, because although I don't think it's very good from a public health point of view, I think it's very hard if we're all isolated the whole time. I think we need to allow some contact between students and their teachers or lecturers, but also so the students can form bonds and have that experience. So it's a difficult one.
I think I'll jump in there, because I've got my daughter's just started university. And I'd agree with Mark that. I mean, I really like the idea that's been proposed that people have contact budgets. And if I had any contact budget at all, I would just let young people have it, because, I can sit at home. I've made my friends. I know my work colleagues. I have established good relationships, and I'm not the one that needs to be out there, but I really feel for young people who are stuck at home, and it's really tough, because this is what it's about. It goes to the heart of risk and benefits, because we're asking young people to stay in and curtail their lives and their personal development when they personally are actually not very much at risk. The difficulty is, I think the balance is, I would really like primary and secondary students to go to carry on their schooling, but do the things that we know works: ventilation, masks, distancing if possible. We've got loads of empty office spaces. Can we not give over some of those to teaching in smaller classes? I just, it's tough, because I know that those kids then come home, they are mixing, they're the key to household mixing, and then they come home to us oldies. But I think us oldies who are parents realise the importance of education and social development in younger people. Very tough.
There's also, because we also have to consider, I mean, it's a lot less, but there are still students, and Shuaib will probably know more about this than me, but there are still children with Kawasaki-like syndrome. So children, and even children without underlying health conditions, are still not completely in the free and clear.
Really, I think there's two kind of side of this, the pandemic. You've got the physical pandemic of COVID, and then you've got the other pandemic, the unseen pandemic of the depression and the consequences of depression, the stress, the anxiety that we're going to follow. And I totally agree with Ange and Mark. We've already have got our connection or established a lot of like a relationship and social, and we can carry our work somehow. But the young people, I think they need that, and otherwise it's going to be a disaster. I don't know, what do you think, Will?
I think in terms of management of the pandemic, we have to resort to very fundamental infection control practice.
Absolutely.
But we've known this from the start, that infections are spread from an individual who is infectious. So you have to identify who is infectious and put a ring around them. And the way you do that is you test. Now, we have to test on a very large scale, and the testing has to be accurate. But not to make this political, but the test and trace system that we have in place is simply not fit for the purpose. I think we've missed the boat with the university students. It was entirely predictable that towards the end of September, if you take thousands of people coming from all sorts of different geographical locations and put them in a fairly small space on the same day, you're going to get outbreaks. We know we we call it freshers flu. It happens every year. Only this time it's SARS-CoV-2. It was predictable. It would have been nice to have been in a position where we could have tested people. When numbers are low, you have a chance of controlling it. But we've got to a state where the numbers are too large.
I think, well, just one thing there, though, I would like to say that even though I'd like to see schools and so on open, I want to see the debate led by paediatricians and child health specialists, because they are the ones that know about the relative risks. You know, what is the balance? What you do, because obviously you strap your kid. Perhaps if you drive your kid to school, you're taking risk every time you put them in the car. So we know that there are risks we take that we've become a kind of acclimatized to, and I would love to see this debate being had by paediatricians. And I know they've written letters and they've pushed very hard this time round to keep the schools open. And I think that, but obviously teachers need protection, staff, ancillary workers, cleaners, all those kind of things, because when schools are massive community hubs and networks where you get households mixing. So it's minimizing as far as possible with, as Will says, known infection control. That's what I would love to see.
Okay, so moving on. So a question from Charles Van Heiningen. Sorry if I've pronounced that wrong. So why is there so little impact of COVID-19 in Africa? You mentioned good contact tracing after Ebola and HIV experience. I'm going to go to Will for that one to start with.
I think it's partly a question of what you don't test for, you don't know. So there were a few countries with HIV who claimed for a very long time they didn't have any cases of HIV, and the reason for that was because they didn't test anybody. So I think you've got a problem of under ascertainment, an infrastructure that's not able to introduce fairly modern technology for testing on a large scale. So I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect there is a lot of COVID that's just not diagnosed.
Yeah, and I think I would definitely add on, I think, as we already know, a lot of COVID will be asymptomatic, majority of them. And when you go to Africa, I mean, a lot of patients might have COVID, not being tested, asymptomatic. But then remember, in Africa, I've got so many other important illnesses there causing a lot of problems, like malaria, schistosomiasis, leishmaniasis, and a few other major problem is still there. We don't see this here. So I think the healthcare infrastructure there is totally different from what we see here.
I think it's also, sorry.
No, you go.
No, just to say, it has the advantage of youth. I mean, it is the youngest continent. So I think the average age is 40 or under 40. So it is a relatively young continent. So it will have some benefits, I'm sure, from that. But beyond that, I can't say why. I mean, there are certain places there are certain countries that have really, well, there is a culture of community and local public health, people going in and knowing the situation on the ground. And so my sister-in-law is in Uganda. They have a really, really strict curfew that I think nobody can be out on the road after something like 7 o'clock. And that's been the case for quite a while. So they're very serious about using the tools that they have, perhaps in order to prevent a worse situation in the future.
There may be an element of climate as well.
Oh, yeah.
Most viruses do not survive in the environment under higher temperature. It's highly likely that this second wave that we're experiencing now is partly driven through the colder temperatures. So it is possible that it wouldn't spread as much in a tropical country.
I think so. From my experience, a brief experience of living in Sierra Leone as well, is that there was a lot of adherence to infection control measures, even when people didn't necessarily understand why they were doing it. So we had our temperatures taken everywhere we went. And I eventually worked out that most of the security guards couldn't actually read the thermometer, particularly one day when I turned up at 24 degrees and they still let me in. But it beeped, and they knew that if it beeped, it was a problem. And there was absolutely no breaking that. You were going through a door, you had your temperature taken. And I think we know that adherence to various infection control measures is not fabulous within this country and within other countries. And I do wonder if there is something with that.
That's quite interesting. A lot of research at the moment, Kib, is about public behavior and patient behavior rather than just pure science. That's quite an interesting section to kind of, yeah.
So moving on, do I have a name for this one? From Harry. How do the effects of global warming and natural disasters affect the rising of pathogens hidden in, say, the permafrost in the Arctic, airborne pathogens, or pathogens transmitted through migratory species? Will the rising global temperatures and sea levels be something of concern to the world of pathogens? I would say yes, but this is probably Will's area.
Okay. I think the biggest risk we have is from existing viruses of other animals. There are estimates that the viruses that we know about and can describe, and we know their structure, is a very small percentage of the total number of viruses, the virome, as it's called, of the planet. And if you go looking for viruses in other species and in the sea, in other environments, using modern genetic technologies, it is staggering the number of microbes that are out there. And the risk is one of those jump species. Usually when organisms jump species, they are highly pathogenic to start with. And that's the danger. Global warming, will encourage and enhance some of that. But then, it's difficult to say, because global cooling would result in less survival in the environment of these organisms. So I don't know, climate change will have dramatic effects, I've no doubt. I wouldn't like to put my money on whether it's going to make increase or decrease the risk of serious infections. I think there's a very high risk, and it's going to stay high.
Doesn't climate change though expand the range of insects that carry diseases and animals that carry them? So I suppose I worry about urbanization, and that the idea that with these massive megatropolises we have, particularly in kind of low middle income countries, that you're building sometimes on ecosystems where you're kind of bringing people and species together where they've never been together before, and I suppose that would be my worry. But I guess the trouble is people need somewhere to live. People need work, so they tend to go to the cities. So it's very hard. I mean, I wonder whether what you think of the Global Virome project. I mean, does it help Will or Mark to try to catalogue the estimated, I think, 1.6 million viruses, animal viruses there are? I mean, to me, I really don't know. I've written about it, and because it would cost, I know, something in the range, it would be a few $1 billion, I think. Do you think it's worth doing?
Well, so, I mean, I was asked earlier, wasn't I, what more could we have done to prepare for this pandemic? So I think that, yeah, I mean, it seems a lot, tall order to try and catalog every one of them, doesn't it? But when you weigh up the cost of doing that as against the cost of what we're going through now, which is, I mean, the last estimate I read was 3 trillion. I mean, before the pandemic struck, CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, was trying to raise, I think, something like 1 billion just for like a list of target diseases that they need to develop vaccines for. And I think they raised something like 750 million towards that target. Actually, the cost of developing a vaccine for COVID is now estimated at something of order of 8 billion. So, it just comes down to, if we're going to do this seriously, it's much better to invest money in these sort of almost long shot, moonshot type projects, so that when the unlikely does happen, we're really in a position to tackle it. So yeah, I mean, I certainly think that we need to look at what other coronaviruses are out there. But also, you mentioned Ebola, Nipah. When they were making that wonderful film by Steven Soderbergh, I think it was based on a Nipah virus combining with a respiratory virus in, a pig. So those are the sort of kind of risks that we have to explore. And we can study them in the laboratory, looking at dual use technologies, as they're called. I mean, it's controversial, but this is crucial work if you want to, get a vaccine ready before or in time to use it during a pandemic.
And so we have an anonymous question, and attempting to remain vaguely apolitical. What hopes do the panel have for an effective vaccine? And if they have hopes for one, how quickly do they think it can be rolled out? Shoaib?
Oh, that's a difficult one, definitely. Well, I mean, if people seen about the vaccine, I mean, the whole world trying to get a perfect vaccine is vaccine are throughout the history is being a problem. And going through this book, for example, reading about people try to get a vaccine for SARS, for Zika, for other viruses, for HIV, which has been for more than 30, 40 years. Vaccine is very, very difficult area. It's not easy answer. And we know from immunology, the immune system is not that straightforward. It's not black and white. You get the vaccine, you get the response, and off you go. So I think is a massive area. And I mean, people have to invest, and people have to pay. And I like the description of SARS from Mark book is the Cinderella of viruses, because not many kind of fund went through in the beginning, going back many years ago. So now that's why we're trying to, after the pandemic hit us and try to get a vaccine, it's quite difficult task, and it's quite a huge task. It's not easy. So I wouldn't be able to describe, how that will be an easy task or what the aims and objective. I think ideally would like a vaccine that will give us a long-term memory immune system or immune response that will stay with us forever, which is, the idea like the childhood vaccine, which been very successful throughout the history, eradicated all these viruses. That's a very big ask and very massive task.
I'd be pretty hopeful. There are a large number of trials going on. I'd be very surprised if none of them were successful. I think the features of the virus, it's remarkably stable for an RNA virus, lends itself to one of these vaccines, if not more than one, will work. I think the key questions are how long protection might last. In terms of when it's going to be produced, I think we're already there. We're just waiting now for the data to show that a given vaccine works. Production of some of these vaccines has gone ahead, awaiting the data. So I think certainly in the first half of next year, I would imagine we will have data. It will show protection, and vaccine will be rolled out. What we won't know is how frequently we have to have booster doses and so on. But I'm pretty hopeful about that. Much more, I mean, obviously HIV, we've been struggling for a vaccine for over 30 years and we haven't got it. But HIV is a very, very different category.
Absolutely. Yeah,
it's very, very variable, and it actually infects the immune system itself. So no, I'd buy shares in the vaccine companies.
I'm optimistic. I mean, I always having written about vaccines also for kind of 6 to 8 months now. You know that you know there are some conditions. There are respiratory conditions like RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, and speaking to immunologists, I spoke to an immunologist who worked on that for years and years, and they still don't have a vaccine for it. But given just how many people are working on it, I really have my fingers crossed that we get something. What I don't know is who it will be effective in, so which age groups. You know, whether the risk benefit will mean that younger people don't have it, so you know there's a little bit of me that wonders, you know, is it going to just cut severe disease like a flu vaccine does, or is it going to stop transmission? That's pretty important, because unless it stops transmission, then we're not going to go back to the world that we all knew. So I'm it's funny enough, I was thinking about booking a holiday for next summer. Slightly holding off because I don't think I'll be vaccinated by then. I think I'm hoping to get one next year, but I just don't know when.
Okay.
Just very quickly. So just very quickly. So I volunteered for a vaccine trial because I'm a big supporter of vaccines. But what worries me, I think we'll certainly get one or probably several vaccines. But what keeps me awake, or I worry about more, is compliance. And because the most likely scenario is we won't have a perfect vaccine that provides 100% protection for all age groups. Hopefully we'll get a vaccine that's quite effective for the elderly age groups, who are the ones we need to protect. But I believe that there aren't that many investigational vaccines for your children or young adults, who are the ones who kind of are spreading it a lot. And then that raises the question, given the level of distrust in society around vaccines. So they've done some shocking polling in the United States showing that 30%, a third of the population, would not accept a vaccine for COVID, even if one were available, right? Because they just don't, either they don't believe vaccines work, or they don't believe that the virus is real. And I think this is a really serious question, especially in a circumstance where, there may not be complete certainty as to what level of protection or what duration of protection. If you're in a scenario of people saying, well, you're going to have to get a booster shot regularly, and maybe children will need several injections, I can see a lot of pushback against that. And I think that'll be a very difficult thing to manage from a public health point of view.
Definitely. Okay, so the final question is a nice, easy, factual one. Mark, can you tell us what your next book will be about?
Oh, that's difficult because I don't want to jinx it. But it will certainly be something around this theme. Like I say, I mean, I'm increasingly finding myself going back to previous epidemics and pandemics. And I'm increasingly interested in when and how they affect social and political change. There's a kind of assumption that pandemics do have these massive effects, but actually I think that just as often they don't, and I'm kind of intrigued as to when and why that might be the case.
Fantastic. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. And I would like to just take a minute to highlight some of the other events that are happening for National Pathology Week. So starting from tomorrow, pathologists and scientists who have recently attended the Royal College online public engagement training will be giving some school talks. There are some virtual pub quizzes happening on Thursday and Friday for medical, biomedical and veterinary science undergraduates. So bring your knowledge caps. And then on Saturday, Dr. Lizzie Burns will be leading an origami workshop for families where they will learn how to fold a beating heart. And then for the last point, so the Royal College has some brilliant competitions. So there is the hashtag Heart of Healthcare Twitter photo competition and the Pathology Careers selfie video competition. You can read about all of these on the Royal College website. And the last things to say is that the Royal College of Pathologists team will be sending around a feedback survey after the event. Please do take a couple of minutes to fill it in, and you'll be entered into a prize draw and could win £20, which is always nice for an evening's work. And then all that's left for me to do is to say thank you to Mark and Ange and Will and Schwabe and Vasha and Penny for hosting. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Stay safe, enjoy lockdown, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you very much, Kip. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Sharp. Thank you, Anjana. Thank you, Will.
Bye.